everyone. So welcome to the invited talk sessions. So it is our honor to have Mihir Bellare as our invited speaker this year. A name like truly needs no introduction in our community, so I will keep my introduction short. So Mihir is a professor of computer science at the University of California, San Diego. He got his bachelor degrees from Caltech, and then a master degree and a PhD degrees from the MIT. Over the course of his career, he has offered several seminal work that have laid the foundations for many cryptographic protocols in widespread use today. I mean, not only in public key cryptography, but far beyond. I mean, here I just want to name a few. For instance, the well-known random oracle models and OAEP and the probabilistic signature schemes. He's perhaps best known for his role in formalizing and advancing the paradigms of provable security, a framework that brought formal foundations to the analysis of cryptographic constructions. And Mihir's work has been widely recognized. He received the RSA Conference Award for Excellence in Mathematics in 2003 and was named an IACR Fellow in 2012 and an ACM Fellow in 2014. And in 2019, he was awarded the Jiaxin Prize for Real-World Cryptography for outstanding contributions to cryptographic design and analysis, which includes the development of random oracle models, HMAX, and also security model for key exchange protocols. And very recently, his research have focused on many interesting, more practice-oriented crypto systems like secure cloud storage and multi-signature and threshold signature. And he's also interested in concrete security for public key cryptography and also two-party computations. I believe this brings us to the topic of today's invited talk. So we are very fortunate to have him here and to hear Mihir's talk on asymptotic versus concrete security, a tale of two cultures, a new direction for multi-party secure computations, and the broader context of our work. So please join me to warmly welcome Mihir here.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks to the chairs for the introduction, for the invitation, and for the kind introduction just given. I'm glad to be here in this beautiful place and beautiful country and in this community. What I presume to take up your time with today is a discussion of two flavors of provable security that kind of divide our community into two camps. And I'll move from general considerations to the particular and novel consideration of multi-party computation, and then to things well outside that domain. If we're asked as cryptographers what we do, we might say that, well, we think a lot, and then we produce things, and these things are schemes, definitions, theorems, proofs, attacks, results. And these are manifested in our publications, papers, and conferences like this one or others, and sometimes also in real-world artifacts like Signal, which include them. And in that sense, cryptography is a technical or mathematical discipline, and we spend our time in that domain. But while we may think that's all there is to it, it isn't. There's another side to this, which is what one might call culture. And it's something that underlies everything we do. It manifests in various opinions or ideas that we have about things like which problems are important and which are not, what is good work and what isn't, what are the right or wrong methodologies to do something, what's of applied significance and what isn't, and whether theoretical work or applied work is better. And all of these things, in a very powerful way, shape what we actually produce. And they also, our opinions about these things vary. across people inside our community. But the insidious thing about culture is that it's largely invisible. We don't talk about it much, and we may not appreciate to the extent to which what we produce is actually determined by that just as much by our mathematics. And so it's like an invisible kind of force out there. So coming to the subject of this talk, it's about these two flavors of provable security. Many of us, of course not all of us, work in the domain of proofs. And whenever we consider a problem there, we begin with this basic choice about whether to use an asymptotic or concrete setting. And we make this choice perhaps consciously, but I would submit more often unconsciously, kind of reactively or based on history, whenever we write a paper in this domain. And that choice manifests in whatever definitions we make, theorems we prove, and in the proofs themselves. And I'd like to examine this choice a bit and see what it applies and means for us. Now that may seem entirely disconnected from the prior slides, but it actually isn't, because when I came to look at this subject, what I found is that it involves not only technical elements and content, but a significant contribution of culture, which determines how we make this choice and what it means to us. And so for a complete understanding and kind of a full and interesting story, it's naturally evolved to consider both of these elements. And so my story will in fact weave a path between them, and you'll see both technical and cultural elements arising side by side. So as an outline, I'll start with general considerations about saying what are asymptotic and concrete security, discussing their history, comparing them, and exploring what the choice means and how it shapes us. And then I'll discuss some new work in a more conventional vein about bringing a concrete approach to a historically asymptotic domain, namely two-party computation. And finally, I will wander much farther afield to some very broad questions about the context and meaning of our work. All right, so on to part one then. So since a lot of this talk will be contrasting these two flavors of security, I should first start by saying what they have in common, which is actually a lot. So both are about provable security, and both manifest in choices we make in the definitions, and both of them are concerned with proofs of security via reductions. The differences are in how they approach and formulate this. At that point, I'll open a slight parenthesis, which is out of consideration for the large and important part of the audience that doesn't actually work in proofs, about which I don't know much. But it did occur to me to wonder whether cryptanalysis, for example, manifests a similar division. For example, algorithms often have their running time written asymptotically. I mean, algorithms like discrete log finding, but then we have records that break primes of a particular size. But anyway, I wouldn't really have the ability to speak meaningfully beyond that. So with that, I'll actually dive into the technical elements of what these frameworks are. So let's start by saying what asymptotic security is. It's dominated by something called a security parameter, which is a central member of the cast. It's an integer, here denoted lambda, and both security and efficiency of schemes are going to be measured as a function of it. And the asymptotic aspect is exactly in the fact that these measurements are done as this parameter goes to infinity. The next element we have is a scheme, and although we often formulate that as a tuple of algorithms, for simplicity I'll view it as a single algorithm. You can always invoke sub-algorithms by giving each of them a name, which would be an argument to this single algorithm. And the scheme takes the security parameter as input, usually encoded in unary, and other inputs as necessary, and provides some output. There will be some security goal with some name, and towards formalizing what it means to achieve that, we might have games. In the asymptotic setting, there won't be just one game. There will be a collection of them, an infinite one, where there's one game for every value of the security parameter. And the games are associated to the scheme and the target notion. And finally, for any adversary, we would associate an advantage in winning the game, defined in some appropriate way, and importantly, a function of the security parameter. So the advantage itself is a function again. In the concrete setting, there isn't a security parameter, at least in the usual or formulation I'd like to consider. And there continues, of course, to be a scheme, but since there's no security parameter, it doesn't have that as input. The other parts are the same. The target security goal tends to have the same name as it would in the other case. When you come to formalize it, you don't need a sequence of games. There's just one game associated to the scheme and goal. And when you define an advantage, it's no longer a function of something. It's just a single number. To make this concrete, we could look at a popular example like signatures, where the scheme takes as input indications of whether to run key generation, signing, or verify by little names in the algorithms, and it does the corresponding job. And the games you're all likely very familiar with, so I won't detail them, but the salient points are that the game on the left, the asymptotic one, you see that the scheme pi gets as input the security parameter in different places, and the game on the right, that isn't true. And the advantage is in either case the property that the game, when run with the adversary, returns true. All right, so now that we have an example, we left off here at having defined these kind of key elements, and now we need to say what security might look like. And for that, in the asymptotic case, we approach a fundamental definition, which is that of a negligible function. You see this in most papers. We often write it as NEGL of lambda. It's a definition that applies to any function mapping integers to real numbers and says that it vanishes faster than the reciprocal of any polynomial. So more formally, once you fix a polynomial, there's somewhere way out there an integer such that after that, the value of the function is below the reciprocal of the polynomial. And as part of the asymptotics, how far you have to go to make this happen doesn't matter. Once we have that, we can give a concise, elegant definition of what it means for a scheme to be secure in the sense of this name T that we want, which is simply that for any polynomial time adversary, if you look at its advantage, which is a function of the security parameter, that function obeys this negligibility definition. And then you can have a theorem, and a typical one would say something like, if a problem P is hard, then a scheme we construct meets this notion of T security. In this case, we would have defined the hardness of the problem by an analogous paradigm. It says polynomial time adversaries have negligible advantage in violating P security, whatever that might be in this case, for example, discrete log. Now, in the concrete case, there's no particular analog of any of these definitions. There's nothing like negligible, and at least in the way I formulated, there's actually no formal notion of a scheme being secure. And of course, we have theorems, but to say what they are, we'd have to look a little further. Now, all this is, of course, at least one side of this picture is highly familiar to most of you, but I might submit that even for those working in provable security, there's a bit of a gap in the sense that one side is significantly more familiar than the other, but we'll see. So moving to look a little closer at that, proofs are always underlain by reductions. So you start with some adversary A trying to violate T security, our goal for our given scheme pi, and we build another one A prime that tries to break this hard problem P. In the asymptotic setting, the reduction plays no role in the theorem statement. It manifests in the proof, where you take a polynomial time A and you build the A prime. In the concrete setting, however, the reduction is the theorem in the sense that you have a statement which says explicitly that if you're given an adversary A with certain running time and also some other resources, usually queries to different oracles, for example, signing oracles for signatures or a random oracle or something else, then we can construct an adversary violating security of our primitive or assumed hard problem. And usually in these cases, the running time is approximately maintained, and we're interested in how the advantage or success probabilities relate to each other. So our constructed adversary, let's say, has some advantage epsilon prime in violating security of its goal. And what the theorem will do is bound the success probability of the given adversary as some function of that of the one we construct, and also potentially of all these queries. And that function is important. It's called the bound, and the quality of that bound is what determines the tightness or quality of the result. So example values of the bound are shown here. The most intuitive or simple is something like you just lose a constant factor of the probability of violating your hard problem. But it could be more. Maybe there's a product by some number of queries to some oracle, or perhaps it drops by as much as a square root. And generally, as you move up this chain, we like the results more since they're considered tighter. All right, so now we know what these frameworks are and how they differ, but then a basic question is, why do we even have two of them? What's it all for? How did this arise, and what are the motivations? And the basic reason comes from when you transition this theory to something practical. Because to be clear, whether you're asymptotic or concrete, so far it is indeed purely theory. But once we have such a scheme, we might be interested in implementing it. And in that case, we might pick, say, to do this over a 256-bit curve, assuming hardness is based on the discrete log problem. And at that point in an elliptic curve, we know that the discrete log problem gave us 128 bits of security. But we really want to know how many bits of security or how much security have we got from our scheme. What is the result of having done these proofs from a practical perspective? So now if we ask the asymptotic side, what they would have to do is effectively throw up their hands and say that the theorem at least doesn't guarantee any security for setting of the security parameter to 256. And the reason for that is that negligible functions are perfectly happy with staying high or a value of 1 until they hit a specific number like 256 and then starting to drop away. So there will be no contradiction to the asymptotic security claim if the scheme you built actually offered no security for this value of the security parameter. But on the concrete side instead, what you can do is use the given bound to determine how much security there was. For example, if your bound lost a factor of 2, you would lose 1 bit of security. If it lost a factor of the number of queries to some oracle, you would lose the log of that many. And you would cut the number of bits of security in half if your bound involved a square root. So while these differences exist, the salient point is that at least we know how much security we're getting from our proof. So this was effectively the reason or motivation for the development and consideration of concrete security, that although asymptotic security gave you a qualitative guarantee, it didn't really give you enough in general to be able to move into a practical setting and decide how much security your scheme is actually going to give you. And if you're interested in applications, it does seem quite important and basic and indeed indispensable. So that's how it kind of arose. Now at this point, the culture wars can already start because the asymptotic side might complain that the prior view is unfair, because if we look at their proof, it isn't the case that the reduction fails to give security at 256 bits. So what's going on here? Well, if you ask the concrete side, they wouldn't disagree with that. They would acknowledge that perhaps it was true, but the point is that we don't really know. The claim being made here is not that the proof doesn't give a guarantee, but that the theorem statement doesn't. And what guarantee is present in the proof is an unknown until you actually examine it. And so the argument would simply be that we should take the trouble to do the concrete analysis and actually figure out what the guarantee is. Because if you're going to be standardizing or using this scheme, you do want to know what these numbers are. So while it's in principle possible in this way to put numbers to the security through these theorems, one might ask if it actually happens in practice. And the answer turns out to be that it does happen significantly often. A recent example of this is an internet RFC that uses the proven secure bounds on GCM to determine limits on how much encryption, how much data one can safely encrypt, and so forth. And this happens in many other domains as well. So having said at a technical level what the bases are, I thought perhaps it might be interesting to look at some history of how all this arose. So we'll start with the asymptotic as the historically first setting, and this arose out of computational complexity theory. So there people study classes like P and BPP and NP, where the notion of efficient is identified with polynomial time. And so it was natural for the founders of provable security to take the same view and also see efficiency as polynomial time and hardness as non-polynomial time. And this is what eventually evolved to what I call the asymptotic framework. It was very convenient for foundational work, which was trying to answer questions about the existence of secure cryptography based on different hardness assumptions, and efficiency at that time was a distant concern. And it became the norm, and it's still the norm for many areas, pretty much dominates in areas like zero knowledge, multi-party computation, and other theoretical areas. And certainly there's an enormous body of work in this area. In the early 90s, a couple of MIT grad students moved to IBM, and they encountered real-world cryptography, which looked quite different because you had objects like block ciphers and hash functions, which have concrete and specific key lengths or output lengths, and there really isn't any security parameter at all, so asymptotic security couldn't really apply. And so they developed, or we developed, concrete frameworks to try to address that for many primitives. And this evolved into what I call the concrete framework. And as part of this, we gave definitions including games, advantage functions, and so forth. And this has also developed into quite a large area. In particular, concrete security makes visible something invisible in the asymptotic setting, which is that you can improve bounds, because once you have them, you can consider improving them, and thus you have the whole domain or field of proof tightness. And this type of approach became the norm in some areas and percolated into many others. So continuing in this historical vein, I thought there's a couple of interesting things we could observe. One is that the early foundational works that I pictured in the prior slide don't actually have the asymptotic framework or even the definitions in the form we now know them. Rather, this seems to have evolved and become standard in about 10 years that follow that work. And if you are interested in history, I thought I could give you a pop quiz. Does anyone know who introduced negligible functions? If you're a theoretician, you probably use this in every paper, but I wonder if you ever asked yourself who first defined that. Any guesses? No? Yeah, it's tough. The answer is Oded Goldreich in early versions of his books. And his books continue to stand as kind of the Bible for asymptotic cryptography. I'd remark that even here, the historical lines are a little blended, because if you look at his books, they don't use the language of games that I use to define the framework, and they don't even define advantage functions. Those actually began in the concrete setting, but they're convenient in either setting, and they help unify, so I use them as a language. And this historical diversion has other, I think, points of educational interest, which one of them is that it's our tendency in our view of history and citation to see the field as in a kind of overly simplistic way, in which we attribute something to one specific place or paper, like a particular definition to one paper. And yet it's as though we think of the idea as being born in that one paper, kind of like the goddess Athena, who skipped childhood and adolescence to emerge as an adult fully clad in armor from the head of Zeus. But in fact, this kind of emergence is rarely true in science. Rather, what happens is that things evolve in a kind of community series of contributions, and they make history somewhat more murky. So there isn't always a single point of origin rather than this evolution. And this is true even if we consider canonical definitions we know well, like INDCPA and INDCCA, which we tend to attribute to one source. But if you actually look back, it's about half a dozen different places that evolved at what we have now. All right, so I want to now take a closer look at some elements of these two frameworks, and in particular, how they fare when it comes to evaluating efficiency improvements in cryptography. So let's say that you have some prior work and it gives a scheme pi1 for some problem, and it's proven to achieve whatever notion we have. T secure, say, a digital signature scheme, so you have some CMA under some assumption, and it has some efficiency. So of course we're very concerned with improving efficiency. So maybe there's a new paper which gives a new scheme pi2, and it's also proven to achieve the same goal under the same assumption, but the claim is that it's faster. And the way that claim is demonstrated is by implementation of these schemes over a 256-bit curve. And now the difficult aspect of this is that the proofs are, in this both cases, asymptotic. I call this paradigm asymptotic cryptographic efficiency, or ACE, and it's extremely common. It manifests in probably hundreds of places in the literature, and it dominates in some areas. But I'd like to question how meaningful it is and say that I could actually obtain results like this in a generic and trivial way, and I'll show how to do that with something called the speed-up theorem. And the conclusion I'd like to take from that is that if we want fair and meaningful comparisons of scheme efficiency, we really do have to do them at same security levels and thus use a concrete framework. So what is the speed-up theorem? What it says is that if you start with a certain scheme pi1, achieving security and having some efficiency, for example, a running time of the protocol is cubic in the security parameter, as comes from doing a constant number of exponentiations in the group, then I can automatically build another scheme with the same security and a running time that's substantially less. And not only is the running time less, but so are other things like signature sizes or ciphertext sizes. And furthermore, you can do this for really a range of different security goals. So how could something like this that sounds too good to be true be possible? The fact is that in an asymptotic framework, it actually is possible. And the proof is very simple. All that you do is you define your new scheme on input the security parameter to run the old one on a reduced value of the security parameter. So rather than giving the old scheme lambda, it gives it the square root of lambda. Since now you're running the old scheme on that smaller parameter, your efficiency obviously becomes the cube of the square root of lambda, which is what the claim was. And asymptotic security is maintained because polynomial time and negligible are objects that don't change with polynomial changes to their inputs. So this speed up then is real in the sense that you will see a demonstrable speed up, and security has been maintained in the asymptotic setting. But obviously there must be some catch. And you see that catch when you move to a concrete setting, which is that, well, since you drop the security parameter, you will obviously have in practice actually dropped security, possibly substantially. For example, in our case, possibly from 128 to 8 bits. So what's the point of this result? Well, just to make the original claim, which is that when you give results that claim efficiency improvements while evaluating security only asymptotically, their meaningfulness is questionable due to the ability to derive these things in alternative ways. So at that point, again, arguments would begin. So the asymptotic view could be that this is all rather misleading and wrong, because the scheme in their paper doesn't do something silly like this speed-up theorem, but it does some genuinely clever change in the protocol which brings them this efficiency. And what one might say in response is that, yes, that could very well be true, but as long as the analysis remains asymptotic, it's not visible at the level of the result statements, and so it's hard to know whether the improvement really was meaningful. And perhaps it would be better to actually do a concrete analysis and figure that out. So having said so many mean things about asymptotics, I should do the same for the concrete side. And indeed, there are some challenges there as well. So it's well known, for example, that there exist adversaries that can break a block cipher in time proportional to 2 to the power 2/3 of the key length. So why isn't that a 2 to the 85 time attack on AES? Because the fact that there exists such an adversary doesn't mean there's any easy way to find it. It's kind of a non-uniform result. Asymptotically, this isn't particularly a problem, but concretely, if you don't formulate definitions and results carefully, you end up having to account for this and thereby lose a lot of concrete security. And in particular, this is an argument against the sometimes used definition and notation in which you parameterize security through, say, running time and query counts. Another critique that's been made is that there are some imprecisions in concrete security statements. And these are things one should definitely do something about. So my own position in this, I think, is somewhat ambiguous. By academic birth, I was working in the asymptotic setting, and I really loved the elegance of that framework. I think I may be the only person who wrote a paper that was entirely about negligible functions. But then came the transition to practice, and with that, the idea that concrete security was useful in that domain. So that leads to questions like how, in fact, can we make decisions about which way to go? And the rational way would be to let the context decide. So you could say, is my question to show the existence of a scheme meeting some definition, in which case asymptotics is natural? Or is it that I'm designing a scheme that's really going to be implemented and used, in which case concrete seems more correct? But if you look out there, it's not clear that the choice is being made like that. What one instead sees is a split based on topics. For example, symmetric cryptography has remained largely on the concrete side. Things like zero knowledge and two-party computation on the asymptotic side. Although the next part of my talk is about changing that. Public key encryption and signatures have seen splits in which there's bodies of work on each side. So one might ask why these things happen. Why is the split like this? And the first observation there is that there's no technical reason for it. Anything that you treat one way, you could in principle treat the other way. And there may even be good reasons to do so. For example, these zero knowledge and other related things are quite important in practice nowadays. And if we're building efficient protocols, it would be worthwhile and perhaps even necessary to treat security concretely. So then why is there this dichotomy? Perhaps it's because there really is a gap in theoretical versus applied motivation on the parts of people who make these choices. But the sense I have is that the gap arises more for cultural reasons and maybe largely conjecture, but I feel like people make their choice based on more like what did I learn, what was my educational history in terms of classes and what my advisor did, or just what do prior papers on the topic do, and those are the things used to make the choice. So this discussion may have given the impression that this is a domain in which there's a set of people who argue with each other about what's the best way to go, but that isn't actually true. What's more the case is little perhaps more surprising, which is that largely they just ignore each other. So each side kind of pursues their own setting and writes their papers. And I kind of wonder if that's positive and whether we can work towards at least kind of acknowledging each other and maybe even becoming friends and cooperating. Because I think there are benefits from doing that. All right, so that concludes this first generic part, and I have just not too much time, but try to go through something more concrete. So in this part, I want to discuss a paper, the one shown. It's joint work with Rishabh Ranjan, Doreen Rippel, and Ali Al-Qadil from AsiaCrypt. And the subject is bringing concrete security to two-party computation. So you probably know what two-party computation is, but just to recall, there are parties who have inputs they want to keep private. There's a functionality F that they're trying to compute. And there's a protocol pi which says what messages they send each other to compute it. And the goal is at the end they should output the result of F on their inputs. And it might have different outputs for the two parties as shown here. An example we'll consider is private set intersection, or PSI. This is the functionality where x1 and x2 are sets. The output of the first party is the intersection of the sets and also the size of the other party's set. And the output of the second party is the size of the first party's set. And security asks that we not learn, a particular party not learn much about the input of the other. This started off in theory, and the first wave of research asked whether this magical sounding goal could even be achieved. And they showed it could by giving protocols under relatively minimal assumptions. And at that point, there wasn't much worry about applications or efficiency. But that's changed recently. We're now racing into a second wave where there's a good deal of practical interest in two-party computation, lots of different applications and implementations. And this is fueled by a lot of new and efficient protocols, not for general functionalities, but for things like private set intersection and oblivious pseudorandom functions. But there's one thing that didn't change, which is that largely speaking, the practical work continued to use an asymptotic framework for security evaluation as inherited from the theoretical side. So now the prior part of the talk kind of kicks in to tell us that maybe there's something worth pursuing and changing in this, because what effectively those prior works are using then when they improve efficiency is what I call this ACE paradigm. And we saw that that's subject to the speed-up theorem, And so it's difficult from results to actually know what security you're getting on particular implementations. So given this situation, it feels like it's a ripe time to bring concrete security to this domain, and in fact overdue. One can again ask why it's the case that for so long it didn't happen, but we saw the reasons. It's really the culture and history at work that said that if that was the culture of the domain, it just kind of got preserved. So this paper's contributions briefly is first of all actually some new definitions which will help us simplify what we do. And it's the introduction of an indistinguishability style definition for two-party computation, which goes against the grain of simulation-based definitions in the area. But what we show is that it's actually equivalent to simulation, at least for important functionalities that we consider. And a second aspect of the definitional treatment is to explicitly and clearly incorporate the random oracle model, which in the past in this domain was used in results, but didn't necessarily show up in definitions. Once we have these definitions, we consider various protocols, in particular what we call the Diffie-Hellman private set intersection protocol, which is created out of the 2-hash Diffie-Hellman oblivious PRF protocol. And we study reductions. We show that the reduction here from the one to the other is tight. And then we show that depending on what algebraic problem you start with, you get reductions of varying tightness to the OPRF. And that enables us to showcase how tightness depends on the assumption made. And finally, we give a new protocol called salted DHPSI, which actually has even better tightness. So one remark or a few here is that all this is only for the semi-honest setting, and the extensions to malicious settings is interesting and important future work. But the honest setting is still one of significant practical interest and protocol development, so it's still quite important, I think. So since in the end this is quite a bit about the definitions, I'll delve into that a little bit more, starting by some kind of classification. So we can think of definitions in cryptography of being of two kinds, single or double quantifier. The ones we are most used to are the first kind. They are things like UFCMA for signatures and all the indistinguishability based ones. And they just simply say, for any adversary, you want its advantage to be low. And these are friendly for concrete security. In particular, they're what I used to develop the whole framework in the prior part of the talk. Simulation-based definitions, on the other hand, involve another entity, the simulator, who enters through another quantifier. And this means that there are some advantages. There's some strong intuition underlying this, especially in two-party computation, but it makes concrete security, while not impossible, somewhat more difficult. And so the preference would be for single quantifier definitions. But since the others have all these advantages, the natural question was, can we somehow have the best of both worlds? And we have a historical context there which says that the answer can be yes. For example, that's what happened for encryption. Indeed, in that case, we have our well-known IND-CPA style definitions of which are indistinguishability based, and the classical work of Kolwasa, Mikali, and others showed that those are equivalent to simulation-based semantic security definitions. And this is one of the cornerstones of modern encryption theory. So what we asked ourselves is whether we can do something like this for two-party computation. And our answer is effectively that you can. So we introduced something called input indistinguishability, and we showed that it's equivalent to a simulation-based definition. Not always, but for classes, a large class of functionality that includes all the ones that we care about in practice. So I'll take a bit of a closer look at how this works. And this is a brief recall of indistinguishability for encryptions in the symmetric setting, where there's a challenge bit and the adversary has access to an oracle for encryption to which it submits two messages, and the challenge one is encrypted and its job is to guess the challenge bit. And so our interest is in extending this type of idea to two-party computation, and we do that by analogy. So what in the encryption case is messages, two of them, that the adversary submits to his oracle, for us will be two different inputs for the honest party. There's another party and it'll have some one fixed input. The role of the ciphertext for two-party computation will be played by the conversation transcript and the view effectively of the dishonest party in the execution, where the honest party's input is set to one of the two challenge ones and our adversary wants to guess which. Now there's a subtle point, which is that in encryption we have to limit the lengths of the messages to be the same to avoid trivial attacks. And that shows up also for the two-party computation, where the restriction corresponds to saying that the functionality outputs must be the same for the dishonest party. But once we do that, it's not hard to put this together. So won't go through the details too much, but we start here by encapsulating in an algorithm called XT the process of running the protocol on given inputs and coins. And it just honestly executes the protocol and returns a conversation transcript and outputs of the parties. And once you have that, you can set up an analog of the encryption definition, and this is our input indistinguishability. So our adversary has access to an oracle called run. It submits a single input for the dishonest party and two for the honest one, and the protocol is executed with a challenge input for the honest party, and whatever the dishonest party should get back is returned to it, transcript and its own output and its own coins. And it has to guess which of the two honest party inputs was used. We have to again take into account this condition that says that trivial wins must be prevented, and here it arises when the functionality outputs on those two honest inputs are different. So we address that by just mandating that the adversary has to query inputs where those two outputs are the same. Since I want to compare this to simulation-based definitions, our paper did also give a definition of simulation-based security for two-party computation. And since we want to incorporate random oracles, we had two forms, the programmable ROM and the non-programmable ROM. And I won't detail these, but in each case, they're done using games, and they do involve a simulator. And the difference is exactly programmability of this random oracle. And in each case, you again get advantages, which now depend also on the simulator. One of the interesting discoveries we made is that there are some subtle points concerning the use of random oracles in the simulation-based definitions. And in particular, this arises when you consider functionalities that call the random oracle. And in that case, the usual way of allowing the simulator to program the random oracle kind of fails, and we show how to fix it. So we also tailored the definitions to allow interesting practical and concrete security considerations. For example, the run oracle or protocol can be called many times, meaning you can consider multiple protocol executions so that we can see how security degrades as a function of them. Having now set up multiple definitions, we wanted to know what is their relative strength. So the non-programmable simulation-based definition is naturally the strongest. It's stronger than the programmable one and implies it. And simulation, even in the weaker sense, implies our new indistinguishably based definition. But the really interesting question is whether one could go backwards. And our main result here is that our input indistinguishability actually implies simulation-based security as long as functionalities have a certain condition that I'll call invertibility. And this condition, the salient fact is that it's present for the functionalities like private set intersection and others we consider. So, so in the interest of time, I won't detail what it looks like. So the conclusion there definitionally would be that at least for private set intersection and related functionalities, we now have a definition that's simple and concrete security friendly and yet just as strong as simulation. And so our next step is to target that in results. So here we looked at the Diffie-Hellman PSI protocol. This is kind of the canonical way of doing private set intersection based on an oblivious PRF. And the most popular choice of oblivious PRF is what's called the 2-hash Diffie-Hellman protocol. So we denoted the corresponding PSI by this Diffie-Hellman PSI. And then we considered security of this PSI protocol, and we studied and showed that it varies in terms of tightness based on what assumption one starts from. So we considered a slew of these, ranging from regular computational Diffie-Hellman and decisional Diffie-Hellman to things involving multi-users with corruptions and verifiability. So here's a brief quick look at our results. Again, the setup is we're given an adversary trying to violate ionized security of our Diffie-Hellman PSI protocol, and it'll have some number of resources and some advantage. And our intent is to build another adversary which violates security of our starting problem, and that problem varies depending on the choice. And we will then see what the bound looks like. And so this table shows us what the different bounds looks like. And what we see is that with computational Diffie-Hellman, you do get a proof, but with a relatively poor bound. There's a quadratic blow up in the number of random oracle queries, another linear one in the number of executions of the protocol, and so on. And the moment you change the assumption, these things start changing. And eventually, when we get to the verifiable CDH assumption, we can actually get tight up to a constant proofs. And we can also do that with the decisional Diffie-Hellman problem. So all this shows that concrete security and tight reductions are quite possible in this domain. Having seen that you can treat security concretely and improve it, begs the question of whether you can give new protocols that do better. And so we do that with what we call the salted Diffie-Hellman PSI protocol. And here are some results about that. And just briefly, what you can see is by comparing the results on that protocol, which are shown in green, to the ones shown in pink, you see that under certain assumptions, they're quite large improvements. And so our protocol has dropped the loss in some fairly perceptible way. So moving forward, what I think is interesting about this domain is that it's largely unexplored. The community of people who are interested in things like proof tightness may find that classical areas of doing it, like public key encryption and signatures, are drying up a little bit. But there's fertile territory in things like two-party computation because pretty much it hasn't really been explored there. All right, so then I can quickly get to the final set of comments. This is a short segment, but it really goes quite far afield into much broader questions. So, well, we all enjoy our work, but many of us also have interest in some kind of broader context, something like societal impact, and we ask ourselves questions about this, like, does what I do matter in the world? Does it have some impact? Does it help? Not everyone has these kinds of doubts or questions, of course. Some people are quite confident and comfortable. They don't ask such things, or they do and they have the answers. But I've never been one of them. I have series of identity crises surrounding things like this. So my own path started as a theoretician, and when I entered cryptography, I believed that theory was important, and of course it is, and it still is, and that's what I pursued. And after some time, I encountered practice and came to the view that it's useful and potentially societally beneficial to do work that's more applied and in particular contributes to things we actually use and appears in standards and products. And that sparked a move into that style of work. But more lately, I've come to see that the situation is a little more subtle than that, because merely looking at usage is an uncertain metric of what value a work has, because there's also the question of what you created is actually used for what purpose, and who it is that actually benefits from this, because not all users are equal in their societal value. And one could discuss that at a very broad level, but since we talked about PSI, I could use that to illustrate what kind of dichotomy there is by asking, well, what kind of applications does this have? Well, on the one hand, there are things like the Callisto tool for privacy-preserving reporting of sexual assault, and it's hard not to like an application like that. And similarly, there are services like Have I Been Pawned, which use private set intersection to see if your password is involved in a breach, which seems clearly something beneficial. But these are low volume usages. If you look at where PSI is being widely used and what's really fueling the growth, it's in things like privacy for the results of reporting on ad conversion. So in here you would have, say, Google and some advertiser, where Google holds the list of the people who went to the web page and saw the ad, and is going to intersect that with the advertiser's list of customers or potential buyers of some of the product, so that they can see how efficacious the placement of the ad was and how much they should continue to pay Google. And indeed, it is used, PSI is used for this purpose. But when you use it this way, you're entering the domain of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, which is the entire economy which profits by effectively selling what you may call as a commodity the attention and interest of us as users. And corporations make large profits based on this economy, but there are lots of studies that show that the impact on the personal health and emotional and psychological beings that we become is somewhat negative. So this is a questionable area to be furthering. And so one comes away with a little bit of ambiguity that if one works on a topic like this, well, what exactly is one doing from a societal perspective? That doesn't seem to be a simple answer. Now, one can also take an even broader perspective on our work. We tend to see cryptography as having rather a big place in our lives, which is natural since we work on it a lot. And our identities are kind of tied to it. But as we look out on the larger universe, there are other things out there. And every time we look at that, maybe cryptography will shrink a little bit in how much importance we might give it. Consider that we're facing climate change and cryptography gets a little smaller. Consider what this whole domain of surveillance capitalism I just discussed, and it might get a little smaller still. Consider this book by Nicholas Carr, which gives quite convincing evidence that the internet is changing the very structure of our brains. Our attention is fragmented. We want constant change and stimulation. We want everything fast. We get deprivation symptoms if we don't see our phone every 2 minutes. And what will be the effects of all this on society downstream? And the cryptography may fade a little bit further with that. And so it goes on. You consider all kids who are emerging anxious and depressed through cell phone usage, pandemics and war and environmental destruction and human greed. And finally, what on earth will he do next? And in the midst of all that, cryptography has almost vanished to the point where I can't see it. So what is to come of this? Well, nothing particularly deep. And if I wanted to find anything wise to say about it, I don't think I really have something. But I do think that a little bit of modesty with regard to the role our work plays in the world wouldn't help, in the sense that we have different identities. Certainly we are researchers and cryptographers, and sometimes we can contribute through that, and that's all to the better. But more often, and something to not forget, is that we can also just contribute through who we are as people and members of society, and maybe we can make powerful differences in that way too. All right, and I'll just stop with that then.
So thank you very much for the very insightful talks. And now let's see if there's any question from the audience.
Regarding this asymptotic versus concrete security, I've seen some work that seem to mix these both by keeping the security parameter, but formulating theorems as you presented it for the concrete security case. So by giving the concrete bounds for the advantage and the runtime just as functions of the security parameter now. And to me, it seems that could give us the best of both worlds, because we now have a well-defined notion of what is security. We avoid these non-uniform adversaries, but we have in the theorem statement all the information we need for concrete security without having to open the security proof. So what do you think of that? And do you think that could give us the, what you presented as joining these worlds together?
Yes, so that's certainly true. I omitted that only because out of kind of simplicity, but you can certainly do that, and it's a nice approach. I think the only question is what to do with settings where there really isn't a security parameter, which is usually the case in symmetric cryptography. But
Okay.
anywhere there is, yeah, I would advocate that.
Okay, thank you.
Is there more questions?
Thank you. Still on the subject of asymptotic versus concrete, as you said, it was very natural to define negligible as smaller than any inverse polynomial. But was that really the best idea? Because I don't know all problems, but when I have an assumption where my best attack is not at least sub-exponential and is just super polynomial, I'm really not confident in that problem. So if I have an asymptotic in which I have a hard assumption plus negligible of lambda, if that negligible is not at least super polynomial, inversely super polynomial, inversely sub-exponential, that means maybe this negligible is just going to be much larger than my advantage in the hard problem, and then the hard problem serves no purpose because the negligible part is going to be the bulk of the advantage.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But I think the answer is just that you would then use concrete security because you would parameterize all of these things. And if you still want a security parameter, you do as he says and use that too.
Yes, but I mean in a larger sense, would defining things with sub-exponential instead of negligible have made sense in the overall picture?
It may have. It's again, this is just what happened historically. So we could imagine that people had gone back and done it differently, and maybe we'd be in that world now. I see no reason not to. I mean, that's perfectly a good choice too.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. So the last slide that you showed at the end was the cryptography getting smaller and smaller. Yeah? I think many of us in the past years had the impression that it's more and more difficult to identify problems that are really worth working on, like dedicating a lot of time to, given that there are huge problems like climate change and so on, where cryptography can really hardly help. Yeah? What kind of advice can you give, if any? It's probably very difficult to people how to find problems that are, you know, adequate for the tools that we have as cryptographers, but at the same time meaningful.
Well, so that's where I guess I had a kind of contrarian view, which is that I think that you needn't be so focused on that, meaning maybe it doesn't matter if the way you make your impact in the world is not as a cryptographer, but some other way, because otherwise you will artificially find these problems, right? You will decide based on ego enhancement to think that some problem is of this high significance, and somehow it's false. So maybe better to just take a different path sometimes. Sorry, it's not an encouraging answer.
What I understood is just work on what you like and where you have fun, which is an answer I can perfectly live with. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, any more questions?
Again, about security treatment. So, do you have any opinion on the framework of the bit security by Micciantio and Volta appearing in Eurocrypt 18?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what I found is that the distinction they make usually doesn't arise, because what they say is for decision problems, in some cases they think the measure currently used is wrong and they want to change it. But in practice, there's a certain condition that makes the standard and their measure actually equivalent. And my experience has been usually that condition is true. And so I haven't found a case where I would really want to switch to that. But obviously such cases could exist.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, if there's not, then we can thank Mihir again. Yeah. And I would like to ask Mihir to stay for a few minutes, because as a general chair and also the program chair, we have a small present for you. And
oh, thank you.
Thanks a lot for accepting our invitations.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And finally, also the last piece of merch arrived, and Mihir will have the pleasure of receiving the first pair of ISER socks at PKC 2025. But don't worry, we have more. So whenever you go up the stairs and past the registration desk again, there will be socks for all of you. They're in 3 different sizes, so please have a look and find a pair that fits you. After that, now there's a free afternoon, so you can do whatever you want, and I really encourage everyone to check out the town of Røros while you have some time and the weather is so nice. And afterwards, for those of you signed up for activities, just a final reminder that those of you going for the guided tour, please meet in the reception at 7. And for those of you attending the beer tasting, you can join us for the walk from the reception at 6:45, or you can meet directly at Kaffestugu, where is the place we will have the beer and the food, at 7. And I sent a link to everyone in an email earlier today. Just recall that there's no dinner today. There will be some food for the beer tasting, but otherwise you need to provide on your own. So this is a nice opportunity to either check out the restaurant downtown or enjoy the lobby and bar at the hotel. And that's it for today. Thank you.